You don't need no reason to travel. Unknown horrors leaving in plain sight. Oh, God, stealing blade drives the world insane. Turn that evil darkness to healing light.
Hello and welcome to Dark Loops, the Seers of Ardham, a podcast in which scholarly, creative, over-the-top fans get together to discuss HBO's fantastic new series, Lovecraft Country. I'm your host, Dr. Scott Jordan, aka Zombie Scotty, a cognitive psychologist, philosopher from Illinois State University. Tonight we discuss episode 2, Whitey on the Moon.
A rat done bit my sister Nell with Whitey on the moon.
All right, so we're going to go to Stanford with the first question. Stanford, favorite scene, favorite line, favorite character?
It has to be the opening. It has to be the opening song, and it has to be like looking at George, just like, you know, I wanted to say experiencing black boy joy, but you know, there's something about a man lying in a bed surrounded by books, happy and smiling and being incredibly black at the same time, listening to the theme song to the Jeffersons, moving on up. I mean, I if that's not the image of just like black man being magnificent that I want to see, I don't know what is.
Fantastic. Yeah. I love that scene as well. Anyone else want to comment on Stanford's favorite scene?
I don't know who the DJ is. I don't know if you call it a DJ, but the soundtrack been on point.
Raphael Sadiq is doing the music. He is one of the two people doing music for Lovecraft Country, so we're in very good hands.
It makes the soundtrack impeccable.
Yeah, I think we're going to be seeing those moments of musical montage joy, you know, at least once an episode throughout the series to contrast the terror that we see basically for the rest of the episode.
Yeah, it seems like it's similar to, like, it's working alongside with the street festival scene from last week, right? Starting with these songs that are, you know, representing this kind of black joy in you know, in black life. And so starting with that one, you know, I think it kind of replicates what it was doing last week, right? With this whole theme of being, you know, this start, like you said, Scott, starting with this joyfulness before it gets to the actual terror. That's
absolutely
happening.
It's actually how I knew the rest of the show was going to be awful. It
Oh,
started off so beautiful, and I was like, well, that was my happy moment.
yeah.
Prepare ourselves, like something's going to go down. Like,
And it did get terrible. I mean,
But I think that that's what allows the show to really ring true, right? Because I mean, even though we live in horror as human beings, we always try or most human beings always try to fashion a little bit of joy, a little bit of something that feeds us, lest we like just you know, fall into the void, right? You know, and that's what makes the void that much more scary. It's that it's that moment for me was the stakes of it all, right?
Yeah.
That moment for me was like, you know, this is, you know, yeah, people don't want to die, but that was why he wanted to live. That was what I loved about it.
Yeah, exactly. Byron, favorite line, favorite character, favorite scene?
So I'll go with my, do I do my favorite line or favorite scene? You know, I'm going to go up my favorite scene. So, of course, you know, for me, my favorite scene is kind of the you know, the ending of it. Well, not the exact end, but with Atticus, with Whitey on the moon playing, right? I absolutely love that scene because I think it, you know, is that juxtaposition. Well, not necessarily juxtaposition, but it's kind of the build up from the moving on up scene to me, right? So we have, you know, the song Moving On Up, you know, it's just kind of, hey, we're coming up and stuff, right? And then we have Whitey on the moon. That's really just like hitting hard,
Yeah.
hitting hard on, Black life in America, while, Whitey's excited about going to the moon, right? And so we
Right.
see that juxtaposition between those two things. The other thing I like so much about that scene is, so remember, like last week, I wasn't sure about Atticus, but his what he did in that scene, right? It was just, first of all, it was beautifully choreographed, right? It was just like you saw him starting to move and let out those screams to that music, to that musical sound, right? And Gil Scott-Heron relying on those drum beats so much on that song, right? And then we see, I'm blanking on her name right now.
No.
His great grandmother.
His great grandmother. I'm blanking on her name. But seeing her come through there with that music and there's this whole thing about this kind of rewriting of history that we see throughout that show, and I think we get to it at that point, right? From him telling the. For me, it all connected from this moment where he was talking about where he was talking about this return to paradise, right? Which I kind of, it made me think about Make America Great Again. But to that point of, seeing his ancestor lead him out, of this resort, right? And hearing about the Masons and all that stuff. It was this complete rewriting of history, right? This retelling of history. So that scene was just really special to me. For it just really hit me hard that we're hearing this kind of retelling of history, this recounting of a history that we don't necessarily get to hear, right? And then shout out, we hear Tulsa in this episode as well, right? When you talk about being in Tulsa. So it's just like this whole, for me, I kept thinking, this whole, when we get to that scene, it's this whole kind of rewriting and this reiterating of history, of Black history in America.
That scene for me had so many levels. First of all, the Gil Scott-Heron tune, Whitey on the Moon. That is exactly what's happening in that scene. Atticus is being used by Braithwaite in order to achieve some kind of nirvana space, right? Something outside of lived life. And I'm not the kind of person that usually says, oh, they did it this way in the book and they did it this way in the movie. But I do want to point out that in the book, what happened was that Caleb, the woman's being played, Braithwaite's daughter on TV was a man, Caleb, in the show, actually slipped Atticus some words of Adam. And in the book, Atticus reads these words from the book of Adam, and that's what destroys the bridge. Because basically what happened is Braithwaite's son used Atticus to destroy his father. What I loved about the rewrite is in the book, Atticus is being used by everyone. And the moment destroying the bridge is not his agency. But in the TV show, it's his agency. And what I loved is the primal scream, right? Just this primal scream that basically destroyed everything. And when we get to my favorite line, I'll talk about entropy because, sorry, but these crazy white people talking about purity without entropy just is so true. I talked about it last week. I'll talk about it again later. But to see his life energy taken out of him to create this perfect place for this white man, right? On the one hand, it sounds metaphoric, but no. When someone's forcing you to work a particular way, to do something for them, that's you using your energy and transforming it into their outcomes. So everything in that scene worked. I love the fact that they did not have him speak the words of Adam. They did not have him speak in the language of Adam. He spoke in the language of suffering and pure rage and despair. And another thing about that scene was the look his great-great-great-grandmother gave him. I still don't know what that look meant. I think it meant, what are you going to do? I ran away. I burned this place down. What are you going to do? And I just thought, that's how I experienced it. Did you guys have the same response? Or?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, but it was her look of guide also. She was a guide, right? That's why I said earlier that word, Orisha, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just Yoruba for it, and it's a guide, right? It's that guide spirit, and those guide spirits made their way to America during the slave trade, during the Atlantic slave trade, right? So that's the kind of the story about that, is that they made their way, the spirits were able to make their way through the trade, right, into America to protect and guide Black folk when they needed to. So to me, it was that she had that look of, I'm your guide, and I'm about to get you out of here, basically. So
yeah, that's probably the better interpretation. I wasn't aware of what you just talked about. I don't
think it's the better. I think your interpretation is good too. I think it was just so much. It's so layered.
It was so fantastic.
I don't think that your interpretations contradict each other necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's actually part of the role of the guide. Is it's not to tell someone where to go, it's to also to show someone their options.
Yeah.
And I felt that was one of the things that was really, at least to me, intriguing about that moment, especially watching that whole place come down, right? Because especially today, where so many shows, they want to stretch everything out forever, right? I mean, I don't mean to be harsh, but if this was Westworld, it would have taken an entire season to get to the end of the second episode of Lovecraft Country. And we would have gone in circles. We would have beat it to death. Right. I actually kind of like the idea that they get to go home. I just wish they were all going home. And I think that that's also what's interesting, because it also hyper contextualizes the whole narrative around the Green Book, right? If the Green Book is going to matter, then we have to have more emphasis on the journey to and from places, as opposed to the horror in each individual place, because the real danger is all the stuff at the side of the road.
It's the journey, not the destination. Absolutely.
That's fantastic.
I want to piggyback off of what Stanford said. There are a couple of things. I guess my favorite scene is a combination of the scene we were discussing previously of Atticus destroying the house, and also the reveal when we find out that George was actually Atticus's father. I will miss George, but like Stanford said, the pacing on the show is fantastic. We left the show where, it was a dead stop. We've closed a chapter and we are moving on. We know that the appearance of the ghost of Atticus's mother, or whatever glimmer that was in the house that interacted with George. And it was also very clever that George knew that she wasn't real. I think we're all going to miss George's intellect and his hyper awareness. I mean, he doesn't. Is anyone going to read the book? Okay, he doesn't die in the book.
Right.
So I'm very interested to see how the rest of the series is going to play out. But I'm very, very pleased with the pacing. I think the sort of Westworld, Game of Thrones trend of dragging things out and shows having secrets from the audience, I'm glad that trend has died. And also the really clever use of music. Whitey on the Moon, I think, rescued a scene that had the potential to be extremely cheesy. I found Samuel and the Order to be incredibly camp. They had those hoods on. I don't know if we have any gamers here, but it was giving me a lot of Resident Evil 4, Los Illuminados.
I'm a D&D guy. They were just a room of clerics.
You know what I mean? I was like,
evil clerics.
it was a bit much, but it was the Whitey on the Moon was a very, very clever use of music there.
That's fantastic. We could do a whole segment on Gil Scott-Heron. He was my introduction in the 80s to what became called rap later on, poetry to music and rhythm. And I'll save that for another podcast, but he's fantastic.
And I didn't like Samuel. I thought Tony Goldwyn's performance was great, but
Yeah.
I don't know if I necessarily liked the way the character was written.
Okay, go ahead and follow that.
Very, very over the top. And again, I guess
okay.
maybe my opinion was a little colored by the book.
Mm.
I was looking for somebody a little bit more older, more cantankerous, and he had a lot more dialogue.
He talked a lot.
A lot
Certainly
of exposition, and it just seemed to drag on for a little bit.
Yeah.
I think if anything really detracted from this episode, it was the scripting for Samuel's character.
I actually felt like one of the problems was I don't think that Tony Goldwyn has really left Scandal behind. I mean, no, I really thought that he was like very much a version of that same character, right? Conservative and problematically so, but still in a weird way, kind of approachable with an odd kind of bizarro charm, and so I mean, and if that's what they wanted, they got it, right?
Mm-hmm.
I thought that what I thought was really interesting and I wanted to see more of was the relationship between him and his daughter.
Yes.
I thought that the daughter was I think that turning the son into a daughter was actually a master stroke.
Mm-hmm.
And it also allowed us to like see certain things in terms of how gender was playing out, right? So you have Letitia being told that she can't go to the dinner, but you also have those moments where the daughter's told to step back as well, right? And so it really brought home it brought home those other problematic elements. I don't think that it would have come through had Letitia been the only woman being told to stay back, right?
I just don't feel like they didn't much with the daughter, though. I mean, they really, Caleb, who is the son in the book, definitely played a much larger role in the story up until this point. And she's sort of window dressing up until this point.
She did create the possibility for that conversation with Atticus about the ring, right? Right, where she says, I've been trying to get one of these all my life, and here you just show up. Just because you're a man, you get one. And he goes, not even a white man at that. I mean, I'm sorry, but it just reminded me of Abraham Lincoln telling someone, well, you can't vote either. And just, oof, they couldn't have done that if it was a guy. So there was a bit of a plot device there. I agree. I found Samuel, for me, kind of appropriate in the sense that if you're really going to be the kind of person that would do this to someone, right? If you're really going to like strip someone down and bathe them in some special herbs and put a robe on them and then try to open a door to nirvana, you've got all kinds of stuff in your head, right? You've got all kinds of bizarre certainties that allow you to treat someone else as an object. And I think the more that we objectify another, the more mythological a story we have to tell ourselves, right? So if you go back and look at the lore of the Southern landowner, there's a mythology there, right? There was a whole ethos of being a white slave owner. Yeah.
But it's very enigmatic in the show, right? There's this air of mystery around him, and I think in the book, the indifference.
Yeah, you're right.
A little bit more historically accurate. In the book, Samuel is so indifferent. He is Atticus is a body, which is, I think, he's just a body. As a slave is just a body here to do your bidding. That body that you need to use to further your station.
Exactly.
And I think I kind of miss that indifference and coldness. I don't know.
Oh, I see. So if they're going to fill him with lofty ideas, that then he's got to have a way to dismiss Atticus.
Correct.
He does that with his creation narrative, which I'll talk about later. But no, that's fantastic. Vanessa.
So I also love the ritual scene. I think that to Cianna's point with the pacing, I think that they're pacing the show much better than the book. I didn't like the pacing in the book. And I also was interested to see how they would do the ritual on screen, because in the book, to me, I was just kind of like, oh, okay, but it was beautiful to me. Everything was beautiful. But my absolute favorite scene was with Uncle George, Atticus, and Letitia in the hallway after
Yes.
they had their episodes, and they sort of all came out and looked at each other, and I think he said, are y'all okay or something? Like he asked if they were okay, and then he gave them like a pep talk, and Uncle George is like he was my favorite. He just, what he provided in that moment, like probably the craziest thing that has ever happened to them and ever just happened. They all knew it was messed up, and everyone is sort of like shooketh, and then here he comes, and he's just calm, centered, and like, we got each other, so we're gonna be okay. And I think that is such a I guess adage or mantra that I think Black people live by, you know, is we got us, so we're okay. And I think that scene to me was just, it was so beautiful. And he's such a fantastic actor. It moved me.
I thought that also what was interesting about that scene is pointing off of it is looking at each of the characters' different experiences, right? You know, I mean, Atticus and Letitia, I mean, literally for both of them, it was trauma and violence, right? Like with Letitia, it starts as, oh, I'm getting some sort of desire, and then next thing you know, the snake pops out of the pants, and it's just like, and even the way they cut the scene, where like he was coming on top of her, and then it switched to the real Atticus, choking the woman. You know, it's like for them, that's what it was all about. What's interesting is for George, he understood that it wasn't real, and he, from what should have been a horrific moment, got closure. You know, he seemed to walk away like even when she goes to kiss him and he just kisses her on the forehead, and it's just like it's almost like that's his moment to say goodbye to a love, and to also assert that the love that he has now is the love that is what matters to him, right? You know, and I thought all of that came out in that moment, and I was like, oh, okay. You know, I mean, and what it said to me is like we can choose. Yes. We can choose to confront horror and be traumatized, or through horror we can get to closure.
And I think to that point also, we've been saying, like, he knew she wasn't real, which I don't want to sound like Morpheus, but like, what is real? Like, how do we define that?
You can sound like that all day as far as I'm concerned. That's my language.
Top five, one of my top 5 favorite movies. But I think he, like you said, Stanford, like, he knew it wasn't real, and he engaged with it as he would if it were. And so I think that sort of like what you're describing, that juxtaposition between, like, I think Letitia didn't know it was real until the snake penis happened, and that like, can we just I was not like, right. What, I don't know, it was okay. But I think Atticus also, like, I think on some level he probably knew that wasn't real, but like you said, because their memories were rooted in trauma, it's kind of like you have a trauma response. So it's like, this isn't real, but I'm reacting as if it is. So yeah, I think that I think that's such a great point that you make, that he made the choice, like, this is not real, but I'm still going to engage with Dora. What was her name? The woman, the lady, Dory. I don't want to call her Dory, like Finding Nemo, but he engaged with her as he would if she were alive, and I think that was, again, like you said, Stanford, him asserting his choice. Whereas I think for Atticus and Letitia, they kind of felt less empowered because of the trauma surrounding their memories.
You know, if we bring that around full circle to the last episode where Atticus said, "Why weren't you there for me?" to George, right? Where that was that moment of separation. And now there's this moment of generational healing that really George is the one in the life position to be able to provide a context for the two of them to heal. So what I love about those opposites is that, yeah, there are choices that George made that maybe Atticus doesn't respect, but at the same time, there's a love there that they both lean into. And when she says, "Yes, sir," that seals the deal, right? She's never said that to anybody. And she's never going to say that to anybody except to him in that moment, right? When he's providing a space for them to both, to both heal, or at least deal with the trauma that they're addressing. My scene isn't a scene, but it's this amazing sense that they created that Black people are always being watched. And they did it in these different ways. So William always pops up out of nowhere as if he had never left, right? So on the one hand, you can think, oh, he's a spirit. On the other hand, cinematically, it's like, if we use Du Bois and the notion of double consciousness, as far as they're concerned, there's always someone there watching them. Then there's the very explicit scene when they're having lunch and they start arguing with each other. And George says, we're being watched. You sit down, right? And then there are these voyeuristic magic scenes where they're all in their room suffering their trauma, and this order of white guys is watching them through these magic walls. And so at no point were they alone, right? And I thought that was a really stunning way to take these different visual contexts and make that same point. And they were the only time that they were, well, not in the presence of whiteness was that scene you just mentioned, right? As well as the end scene, right? They were alone together in that scene, and they were alone together in the hallway. And I thought that there was just a beautiful juxtaposition to show what we do together, and the rest of the time we're being watched. I just thought that was really well done.
And one thing that also picking up on that, what I thought was interesting is the scene where it was actually one of the scenes that made no sense to me, which was when they're coming back from the village and they let the sun go down on them. And I'm thinking to myself, you know what? After everything you've experienced, I would be thinking that if you see the sun going down, you'd be hauling ass back there, right? You'd be hauling ass back to the crib. But the way the monsters just came up from underground and surrounded them, and then when they left, they just went back underground. Once that happened, I'm like, oh, those things are always underneath them.
Always.
They're always just there waiting for the like usually when we think of voyeurism, we think of something seeing us from above, right?
Yeah.
And the idea of something watching us from below was, to me, was actually more horrific. Because when something is watching you from above, if you just look up, you can see it. But you can't even see this, but you know it's there.
Yeah. So that's another element to this idea. Absolutely.
And I think to that point too, like each time you described, Scott, that they were alone and together and not being watched, again, was like shrouded in this like shared trauma. So at the first scene in the hallway, they all had those sort of traumas. And then the last scene, all of those shenanigans that happened. So it's like the solidarity, the sort of independent solidarity that we see is sort of like always in the face of, I don't want to say always, but is more often than not in the face of a trauma. And I think that, again, that is like we talked about last week, a sort of good metaphor, if you will, a representation of what it's like to be Black in America, because I think that's one thing that like unites all Black folk across America is the shared trauma of like, you know, like racism and systemic injustice.
You look at the double consciousness of a Black president, and then you look at the seeming lack of consciousness of a white president, right? And there's just no sense of being watched. No sense of caring if you're being, or maybe there is a sense of, yes, I'm being watched, watch all the trauma I can produce, watch all the bad things I can do to people. And it's
the panopticon is always from a position of power, though, right? So he doesn't have to care if he's even being watched, right? The power comes from, I'm looking at you, this constant state of surveillance for Black folk, right? And I think that's what I really love so much about that scene, is that it was playing, I think it was really playing on this, on Foucault's notion of like punishment, right? And that panopticon, how we're always observed. I think it's really interesting though, Stanford, when you talk about that from under, right? I don't even know how to make sense of that, right? You know, or does that mean that, you know, that kind of surveillance can happen from any angle, right? That
Yes.
surveillance of folk can happen from any angle. But I think it really did a good job with playing on this notion of, because I mean, they are in this, that resort towers above,
Right.
right?
But
And
the
so-
monsters aren't just playing on from any angle. The angle that they're coming from is actually from that thing which we intuitively equate with stability. When we talk about stability, we talk about the earth beneath our feet.
Yep.
Grounding. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And
No, well said.
and grounding, and they take that away.
Mm-hmm.
They do. I wanna go back to Byron's point. At the same time, all the other scenes where they're being watched leads to this idea of being watched from every angle. And I hadn't made the connection you did with the ground, but you're absolutely right. There's no stable space other than when we're together. I mean, actually together, protecting each other in our space.
Where's the stable space for Black folk? I mean,
Yeah.
is there a stable space?
Right.
I don't know, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Leandra. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Before we move on, this is totally unrelated, but okay, William, is that his name? And the daughter, they look like very much alike to me. Does anybody like they look alike physically? They give me real like the Damned children vibes. With
They totally do. That's
like
exactly.
I don't know. And every time he appears, I'm just like, oh my God. He's like, I don't. But they look just alike to me. They're. I don't know if that's gonna be. Maybe it's too much Young and the Restless influence because I still watch the Young and the Restless. But I feel like they're about to be like siblings, or like maybe this is like a Cersei and Jaime situation going on.
Right.
But they look very much alike to me, and I don't know. I don't know. It's
Well,
weird.
the Valley of the. Oh, go ahead. Well, the
No.
Valley of the Damned vibe was totally there. I also got kind of an Aryan race vibe.
Yes.
Right.
Okay.
These were pure Aryans, and their quest to get to this non-entropic space, which we'll talk about later, which doesn't exist, was caught up with that hair color and everything. It's like,
Gosh, like
damn, y'all.
I don't know. It's weird. To me.
Yeah. So, Leandra, favorite scene, character, line?
Yeah, so also I just want to say, I just assumed they were twins. I don't know why I did that. I also picked up on like, as soon as we saw William, I was like, oh, so he's like Aryan. Like he's that kind of like, okay. So I'm going to do like my favorite quote, just because I think my scene overlaps so much with everyone else. But my favorite quote is when Christina, the daughter, is talking to Atticus after he sees everything they have that whole biblical lyricism for simple people conversation. And she's trying to say, like, not all white people are out to get you. Like, you could make friends. Like, we could be friends. And she keeps trying to drop these hints of, like, I'm a woman. I experienced this too, which I think is a very quintessential white woman thing to do, like, right? And so she's trying to convince him that, like, he can trust her by throwing this out there. And he says, that's going to take action, not just promises. And I don't... When that happened, I was like, if that isn't something I wish every single person could actually understand.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's like she says something like, well, I saved you on that bridge or something. And like, I think we have this tendency in America to be like, oh, well, like, you're alive. And it's like, okay, well, like, saving my life isn't enough. Like, you have to let me live. Like, you have to actually let me out. Like, I have to be free. Mm-hmm. It's not just enough to be alive. And I think that his comeback for that was so beautiful. And then, later she gets the opportunity and he looks at her and is like, this is what I'm talking about, as he's being held at gunpoint, and she looks away. And she convinced herself that, like, she didn't have power or she couldn't do anything in that moment, but, like, you didn't even try. Mm-hmm. So, like, I felt like that whole exchange was a really good take on, and this is just how I see what happened in 2016 about the role that white women play and potential, just the ongoing cycle of oppression of people of color, and the fact that the centering that happened in that whole scene, and the fact that you can't just have performative lip service, like, you have to take action. So yeah, that was my favorite quote.
Well, go ahead, Byron.
Well, I mean, you see that, I think you can see that between her and I guess I'm just gonna call it the sheriff kind of woman, right? Where you see that complicity, right? That complicity of white women in slavery, moving forward, right? In those two characters, I think. And I think, we see the sheriff kind of person being more, what we would think of as kind of an overseer of sorts, right? But still, she plays that role. We can see that complicity of white womanhood in this, oppressive state, right? And making sure that these Black people stay in their place.
I felt like she was a lot easier to take, the sheriff, because she's so explicitly
Right.
Whereas, so I just got done reading Just Medicine, and Dr. Matthew does a great job of explaining how people of color, when they're having these interactions in healthcare, actually trust someone who's implicitly biased but not explicitly biased less than someone who is explicitly biased. And so that whole, I almost felt more comfortable with her because you knew what you were getting and you knew what to watch out for and you knew not to trust her. Whereas Christina's trying to say, I've got your back, like secretly. And then she ends up not, which is the whole story, but
No, she's also as you say, she's in a position of power, right? And so not only is she cognitively complicit, but she also shucks the violence work out to someone else. Right. So she doesn't have to do the violence. Therefore, she gets to pretend that she's good, that she's noble, and she's being a nice person. And I'll leave it at that.
Is she really?
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I feel like what you have in her is a person with extremely contingent power, right? So
yes, okay, well said.
The reason she doesn't act is to maintain that contingent power that she gets through her father that she can never truly have, right? And I think that that's actually the reason why, coming out of an election, you could have such a moment where an action or lack of action leads to a massive amount of distrust, right? Because it's like, oh, even if you have the best of intentions, you're not going to act on those best of intentions when you have that moment where your contingent power is threatened, when you have that moment where you might actually really be on my level.
Yep.
And I also want to say, like, to sort of like Leandra's point, and to circle back to the ritual scene, that's one thing that I appreciate that they changed from the book to the show is there was an opportunity for Christina to be the white savior, and they did not allow that. I'm hoping that's not
right,
because that's gonna piss me off.
right.
But the fact that wasn't a thing, and I think what you said, Leandra, was so spot on. It's so beautiful in terms of the at least responses that you give when you're talking about issues of race relations. Well, at least you have this. Well, at least you have, and it's like, is I'm supposed to be okay with that? And I think from a psychological perspective, at least responses fuel disconnection. Brene Brown is like the leading person on empathy, and she talks about that all the time. If someone is telling me about some issue or trauma that they have, and I say, well, at least it wasn't this, that is not validating, that is not empathic, that actually drives disconnection. So even in that moment, I think Christina was basically sabotaging herself, because she's like, yeah, we're in this together, what's up? And it's like, no. And I'm happy he didn't fall for that. I really hope he doesn't. And that's why I was nervous about them making her a woman, but that's a conversation.
I think the at least response, at least is basically code for shut up. Right? I don't want to hear anymore. You're challenging my borders, and I need to go home and make dinner and be able to sleep tonight. And so it's more about the person saying the words than it is about the person they're talking to. And so much language as therapists, so much language is diagnostic of who's speaking, not what they're talking about, but the person doing the talking. So I think they handled that really well. And the fact that she used her contingent power to try to ally herself with Atticus, right, where she said, I really wanted one of these rings too, but I can't have one because they won't give me one. That's the contingent power you mentioned, right? We're kind of in the same boat.
I'm not the same boat. Really quickly, I wanted to bring up, so you said how she doesn't use her power, she lets other people do the violence, yet she's the one nurturing the monster when it's born.
Yes.
She's nurturing what ends up being the thing that chases them down, right? So I feel like that's also a beautiful moment of showing white women as the nurturing power that ends up raising white male men who can't take shit, right? They're fragile, They think they're in power. They think they're owed everything. They're entitled. Like, I felt like that whole, I'm not saying all white men are like that. I'm not saying that. I'm just.
I get it. No, that's fantastic.
Like, I just feel like that whole point is like, I'm not violent. I'm nurturing. I give life. And perpetuating it still.
And then they take it on my behalf.
But it's the thing that white women always get. Some white women, our society has a way of giving them the benefit of the doubt. And it's the difference between being complicit and being, you know, like Hillary, an active participant. You know, Hillary, and we see this in media all the time. And I'll never forget just how disgusted. Do you guys remember that movie with Kate Winslet, The Reader?
Yes.
And it was loosely based off the life, I think, of Irma Gress. I don't know how that might not be accurate, but it's this movie that builds sympathy around an SS guard at Auschwitz, and this poor woman can't read. She's illiterate. And it was supposed to, I don't know what they were trying to accomplish with that movie. I really, really don't.
Right.
But there was some sympathy that I didn't feel. I didn't connect with this character at all in any way. But the way that it was being hailed and lauded as one of the, you know, it was up for Best Picture. Kate Winslet won an Oscar for Best Actress. And I just couldn't imagine a movie like that being made today. I just really, really couldn't. But again, you know, when we look at these movements, when we look at the Ku Klux Klan, when we look at the Confederacy, when we look at the rebirth of the KKK in the 30s, these movements were being propped up and supported by white women. And I think they often, history tends to give them a pass. And sort of plays on this stereotype of weakness and innocence that I think African Americans and people of color can say, you know, given I can think of some of the interactions that I've had with white women, whether in the workplace or white women in positions of powers. I can tell you that, you know, they're anything but. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know if I struggle as to whether or not I call Christina complicit or calculating.
So
I don't know if I buy that. I don't know that. I think she's very, very calculating. I think she knew exactly what she was doing. And she walks away without getting her hands dirty. That's the point, I think.
I can't see either one of those women as less complicit than the other, right? We know that sheriff woman, you know, speaks it, but I guess for me, from the first episode, when she stepped out of what's her name, Chris, when she stepped out of that car, for me, and this is going to sound really ugly, I was like, oh, what's she about to do? You know, and I guess for me, it takes me back to childhood memories of, you know, and I think I said this last week, where we grew up on this street where we were like the second black family or the third black family that moved on this street. And the neighbors across the street were just extremely nasty to us, right? But especially the mother. Right? Quiet and composed, but she was still nasty. You know, and this is what my mother dealt with white women all her life. So I guess for me, as soon as I saw her, I was like, oh, what kind of evilness is she going to be up to? So I knew there was something. And I mean, I know that it sounds ugly, but I just, you know, the fact to me that she cast spells to keep them from remembering things automatically made her just as ugly and evil as the sheriff woman, right?
Yes.
So, you know, I guess for me, she didn't get a pass from the very beginning. And I know that's not what you've been saying, but you know.
And Byron, like what you're describing too, that was my exact reaction to the scene where lucky her, she got to have a conversation with Atticus when he was like naked. She was sitting in front of him.
Yeah.
I was like, girl, how can you focus? But she was focused. So The
Yeah.
whole conversation about the ring and you just get one, like I rolled my eyes the entire time. I'm like, girl, this ain't about you. Shut up. And I'm
Yes,
standing
no,
here like
exactly.
about to be sacrificed so your daddy can go back to the Garden of Eden. And you up here like, I don't have a ring. Shut up. So that was my like, I don't like
Yeah.
her like at
Yeah.
all. Not just because she looks creepy, but which I mean, not in real life. Her character.
What I really do like about the character is not the character, but the conversation it's fostering. I mean, our culture is the concept of systemic racism is getting a traction that it has never had. And when you start talking about systemic racism, you start talking about complicity, and you take racism out of the head and you put it into the world that stays the same because of what you do. So you can do everything in the world for the best of your kids, right? You can wear the clothes, have the job, walk the walk, talk the talk, all in the name of taking care of your kids. What that simultaneously does is keep other people in certain places, in certain psychological states. Psychologically, all you're doing is good things. So what I love about our current conversation, when we're, like I said, about systemic racism, I would argue we're getting it out of the head and we're looking at it in the world. And what's staying the same in the world because of the way you live your life. And I think when we start to look at it that way, then we can have real conversations about policy change. Oh, if it's in the world, then we need to change the world. And I would dare to say hearts and minds will follow, because their narrative will come to be embedded in the narrative we're creating and living in. So she gives flesh to that thought. She gives flesh to that conversation. And so like I said, I don't like the character, but I do like the conversation it's fostering. All right, then we will go to Stanford. Favorite line, favorite character, favorite scene.
I'll go with my favorite line because I already did my favorite scene.
Yeah.
It's that moment when Atticus and George are being seated at the dinner with the cult, and William leans over and says, "Just because they don't want you here doesn't mean you aren't supposed to be." And I felt like that line, when that line was uttered, I was like, I honestly felt like that was a description of my life. I felt like that was a description of what living in America is for an African American.
Well said. That's so profound. I don't have a reaction, man. Drop the mic.
And I will say,
their own home.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I will say that for William in that situation, and it kind of goes back to what you were talking about earlier, Scott, about systemic racism. But I think the conversations we're having now too are pushing the boundaries of what white people's roles are and changing what's going on. So the models of allyship. So what does it look like to be a white ally and fight against racism? And it's more than just making that statement. So William, we should be up here breaking tables, what I'm saying? You said something and that's cute. But we need more than that. And so I think obviously for the time it was, what I'm saying? But I think what I think that we're now, the conversation that we're having now in 2020 today is acknowledging it is not enough. We have to move beyond that towards action. And even sometimes just acknowledging it, that's the difference between non-racism and anti-racism. So non-racism is, I'm not racist, I acknowledge it, I see that it exists, but white people have to be actively anti-racist, which means putting in the work and doing what needs to be done for anything to change. And so I think that what you're talking about, Stanford, with that scene, it's kind of okay, you got check one. Now check two is do some shit. I mean, obviously this is action,
all right, no, yeah,
it infuriates me. Especially the whispers in dark corners. I just want you to know I saw what happened at that meeting, and it makes me just don't say anything. Just don't say anything after the fact in the parking lot. A week later at happy hour, can I talk to you for? No.
You had your chance in the moment.
It means nothing to me.
Or
I'm watching you be browbeaten, be abused, and I want you to know that I see it. I saw it, but I'm not willing to say or do anything about it.
Yeah. You're so strong. You can handle it. You're so strong. I don't know where to do that. I'm sorry.
No,
So
go ahead.
I apologize.
No, Leandra, you want to say something?
No, I was
You just agree. Okay.
because I feel like I see this happen all the time. It actually happened earlier this week where like it just it just happens, and then like someone tries to like say something later, and they're like, "Well, I'll make it up to you." Like, there's no like I feel like even with like Christina, this like I don't know. So it's a whole other tangent about white women and how like you when something happens, you're like, "How do I make it right? How do I make it?" There's no making it right.
Yes.
There's no fixing it. It's how do I stop it from happening again?
What,
That is what you need to say.
yes.
And so when you're coming over there like, oh, like Cianna was saying, like, I saw that, I'm here for you. Like, and I do peer regression research. That doesn't work. Like, just doesn't work. It is not an intervention model that is effective. And so if we can tell our kids that, why can't we do that as adults? I don't understand.
Well,
what you a 12-year-old to understand that, but you can't do it. So anyway, that's my whole
No, I think one of the challenges that we're currently facing with microaggression training is it's not behavioral. It's cognitive. And what people don't understand about the moment of a microaggression is you leave the victim with about 800 milliseconds to make a decision. Now, my experience has been more with gender harassment, where I've seen women, a man say something, usually in the form of a joke, right? In an attempt to sort of establish a we relationship with that person and demonstrate to everybody else in the room that we're friends. How do you know that? Because I can give this person crap, right? So they say something, and that because it's a joke, you can always retreat from it and say it was a joke. And what I see the victim do is they're stuck for about 800 milliseconds. And in those 800 milliseconds, they're making a clear choice. Call this person out right now in front of everybody and rupture everybody's conscious awareness about the moment, or laugh it off. Because if I laugh it off, I accept, I make the joke narrative coherent, and we all move along. The problem is it's later on when you're suffering with the fact you didn't act.
And I think, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you
No, go
off,
ahead, go ahead.
I think what's different from gender to racial microaggressions, and I think what people don't understand about sort of the insidious nature of racial microaggressions is am I tripping? Like, did that person just say something to me? And is it because I'm Black? Like that, like chronicity, if that's a word, like the chronic nature of microaggressions, but also the like second guessing of yourself, not should I act? Did I interpret that correctly? Is something that I think people don't understand how that, and for understanding stress and how over time, how that turns into like trauma. Because every day of my life, I have at least one interaction where I'm like, what they say? You know what I'm saying? What?
Yeah.
And so like not even being able to trust your own interpretations, having to second guess. And so like what you're describing, Scott, I think that for people of color, or, in the instance of racial microaggressions, there's like that added layer of like, did I hear them correctly? Did they really just say that to me? Is it because of my race? You know what I'm saying?
And then you address it and you say, did I overreact? And then guilt starts to set in. Did I go too far? Was that necessary? Did I hurt, did I overreact? Did I hurt their feelings? I mean, I absolutely agree with you 100%. There are layers and
then last week we talked about who you're going to go to, right? And one of the problems is to generate a moment of consciousness in a group is a risk, right? To basically to push everybody out of their unconscious narratives and make them woke in that moment is risky. And people, it either comes with who you are to some extent, or you have to learn how to do it. And people aren't going to start calling people out in public until they can trust that the public is going to be receptive to that moment of conscious rupturing. So I would argue we actually need to practice people calling other people out for microaggressions, and then have people experience not experiencing pushback. Like last week when Atticus said to George, why didn't you take care of me? And George just absorbed it, right? That's the thing we need to see modeled. That's how we have to, and it's going to take practice, because consciousness, man, it's so much work. It's just so much work.
It's going to take practice, but it's also going to take action. I mean, consciousness does take work, And it is a risk, especially when you are a person of color and you are that lonely only in the workplace, in the department. There is safety in numbers, like we were discussing with George, Atticus, and Letitia. As long as we have each other's back, we're going to be okay. That, unfortunately, is not always the case for African Americans, Blacks, and people of color in the work, especially in the workplace. Especially because you can't force consciousness. And I think that we're the only voice of dissent, and we know where that gets us.
Fair enough.
You know?
Yeah. Go ahead.
And I think what we're also not talking enough about is that most of these microaggressions, part of what makes them aggressive is that they are precursors to violence and death.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, you know, for an African American, it's not just that I stick out and I feel self-conscious because I stick out. It's I stick out and I realize that there's a history of people sticking out ending up on trees. It's also that you know, it's like even what we're dealing with now, right? It's like you know, we've had the whole thing with Jacob Blake, right? It's like what happened to Jacob Blake is actually what we imagine happening as a response to our calling out a microaggression, a situation that escalates.
Yes.
And if we're lucky, we just don't get to walk for the rest of our lives. And so when you start talking about this thing about like, oh, well, you just have to work up the courage to stand up for yourself. It's not about standing up for yourself. It's about wondering. It's not just about the doubt of did I interpret that right? It's the did I interpret that right is also overlaid with doubt as to whether or not I'm going to come home tonight.
Yeah.
It's that's exactly right. It's willing to stand up for yourself and what's right for Black people and people of color kind of goes hand in hand. The conversation you're having is, what am I willing to lose?
Yes.
My job, my home, my life, you know, my ability to walk, my ability to maybe ever see my family again. I mean, those things go hand in hand.
Right.
And like you said, you have, you know, a millisecond.
Yes.
Sort of weigh all of those options and make a decision.
And I think that's the thing about that scene, right? That we point out, that you can point out from that scene, is that for me, when I saw that scene, I started immediately thinking about, I shouldn't have to do this damn work.
Yes.
That shouldn't fall on me.
Right.
That's again, everything you said here, those are all those fears that you might not walk again, that you might not come home, that you might get strung up on a tree, right? All those things. So to me, that means, well, damn it, my time is done for trying to do this work. It's not like we haven't said these things in the past.
Yeah.
Correct.
There's nothing new to this, right?
Right.
But it's a matter of shifting now that responsibility, right?
Absolutely.
And I think to your point, Byron, like the reason that white people are not willing to do that work is because it's going to shift the privilege. Like the white privilege will not be a thing anymore if all the white people start to stand up and do the work, because that's the whole point of dismantling the system is to like equity. And so if me speaking up for, you know, my Black coworker means I'm losing something, oh no. Oh, yeah. Whereas, you know, white people are fighting against losing privilege. And to Stanford and Cianna's point, Black people are fighting for life. That's the entire essence of the Black Lives Matter movement.
Right.
You might lose friends, I might lose a family member or a life. And so tell me how those skills are balanced, and tell me how that means the responsibility is on me, because it's not.
No, absolutely. I usually don't. I have to say that when I said about training, I meant everybody. I'm white people. That's what I was kind of after, is that people have to not be bystanders. People have to learn how to call out. And I think part of that is actually practicing it. I'm not lying. I think that setting up scenarios where people actually see a microaggression and someone actually practices calling people out, because in that 800 milliseconds, you know, the practicing it will make it a skill. And I think as we make it a skill, then we will expect that skill to be present in the world. And then how we're in the world from moment to moment will change. You know, I started all that by saying I think our approach to microaggressions is a bit cognitive, right? And we need to actually get to what people are doing with their bodies and their mouths in the moment.
Yeah.
You know, and that's kind of what I was after. So, Leandra, you wanted to say something? Or?
No, I was going to say, my knee-jerk response to when you were saying that was kind of along the lines with Vanessa, because I thought you were talking about white people needing other white people to validate them when they spoke up, and I was going to be like, no, like, they don't need to practice, they need to get over their fear of what they're going to lose. And I think that that's exactly, like, I was just kind of sitting there and I'm like, no, it's fear. Like, they're afraid to say the wrong thing, they're afraid of this, like what Stanford said earlier, losing power that you don't actually have.
Right.
And so I think that was, but now that you said it that way, I think I understand better what you were actually saying. You know,
words take time. Apologize.
Especially this late at night, and got 2 kids trying to get me. Yeah, it's fine. But I do think that the idea of this fear of losing power and the fear of, like, it'll all go away, like, they just don't understand the equitable approach to it, right? And it's just a fear-based response, which is another reason you're right about practice. I mean, it's what we do with people when you have a fear response, is to practice getting past it. Because I don't think there's ever going to be a situation anytime soon, at least, where other people in the room back you up immediately. You got to get over the fear. You got to get over the fact that you're going to lose friends, that you're going to lose face with the bots. Like, white people just have to get over it. You're not
and
going
then
to get over the sport.
The extent to which a person respects themselves has to come to be tied to how much they take care of others.
And bringing it back to Christina, old funky ass, like, I think for her, that was her entire caring concern about Atticus was rooted in her own, like, oh, what's going to happen to me? You know, like, here I am in this big ass mansion that I live in, but I don't have a ring.
Yeah.
You're about to lose your mansion. It's gone.
Right. But you got that car out there, though. That magic car. Be quiet. Be quiet.
Exactly. Go ahead.
I just said she's got her monster babies. I don't know what.
Oh my God.
Now I'm thinking about it.
No. Cianna.
I'm just.
Go ahead, Stanford.
After what you said earlier about comparing the babies to, like, white women having kids with them, I'm just thinking, yep, kid's gonna get an AR-15 and go across state lines and shoot someone. You know, I mean, it's all of this is it's troubling, even more so because they've managed to write something that, whether you like it or not, has all of the parallels.
Yep. Oh, I was going to follow up and say she nurses them mothers them into the world, and then she's the one that controls them.
She weaponizes them.
Exactly. And
white women do really well as weaponize.
And then she covers up for them by stealing people's memories.
Yep.
Yes, exactly. And then she also uses them as a threat. She weaponizes them. But there's that scene where they come out of the ground and she's blowing the whistle, and it's clear that she's enjoying that power, right? It's clear that she's in her element and she's happy that they're scared, right? Or at least it's fulfilled her role that they're scared at that moment. So yeah,
she's an active and willing participant.
Yes.
Exactly. Yeah.
They are allowed to those creatures are allowed to traumatize the Black body and then go away without punishment.
And be protected underground.
Protected underground, exactly.
Yep. Cianna,
Yes,
second
sir.
question.
I guess I want to go back to my favorite character, which sadly, I didn't really have one last week. George was, in the running. He was in the running for first, and he was my favorite character. Turns out it was George all along, and now he is no longer with us. He was very, very wise, and there's a clumsiness to Michael K. Williams' character that I kind of find a little endearing towards the end. He was really, really annoying in the book, and he was really, really annoying when he first came on screen. But towards the end, I was just kind of like, I think he might be. I think he might be my favorite character so far. I have warmed to Letitia, and Atticus is sort of dropped a space or two. I think I'm with you, Byron. I feel like he's gonna do something really, really, really dumb.
I feel like Atticus he's basically being written as sort of the classic superhero, right? When you look at most of the superheroes in the comics, once they've been around for more than a year, their job is to be the most boring character in the book. And then we get excited when the villains show up, right? I mean, Batman is not that interesting. He's got the same whisper, gravelly voice. He lurks in the shadows. And then these villains pop up and they're like ghetto fabulous and shit, right? I mean, it's just morals aside, I mean, who do you want to hang out with? Batman or the Joker? Who do you want to hang out with? Batman or the Riddler? I mean, and I feel like that's what Atticus's role in this. His role is just to be there and be boring. And the only moments when he's not boring is when his clothes are off.
I mean,
I thought it was
which is not the worst thing in the world.
No, I'm not. Although I will say, to your point about the villain, I feel like I realized I grew up when all of a sudden I wanted to be Ursula and not Ariel.
Well said.
Every time I do something, I think of her. I channel her when I'm trying to be a badass. Like, I think you're totally right about that. It's just a vehicle for everyone else's story.
I thought it was interesting that Atticus was the one who stayed woke the whole time. And I wasn't exactly sure what the writers were accomplishing that.
I thought it's because he was a direct descendant of
So the spell wouldn't work on him?
That was my understanding.
That simple? Yeah. Okay, well, if it's that okay, I'll take that. But I thought that his primal scream during the ceremony was, as Stanford's saying, sort of the beginning of an origin story. I mean, he's witnessing trauma and horror all his life, and now he's witnessing this cosmic horror, this cosmic racism, and there's something in him that's going to become different, I think, because of that. What it is, we'll see.
Also, who was he? Was that the woman he was fighting? Was that supposed to be his girlfriend?
Yes, from
Korea. Yeah.
Okay.
I did the subtitles the second time I watched it, and he said something to the effect of like, "I love you, I don't want to hurt you," or like, if you watch the subtitles, like it's very clear that like they had a.
Oh, I missed that.
Yeah.
But
I thought in that scene that they were all seeing the person they love, and I felt like Atticus and Letty weren't as settled in that relationship, and that's why it turned violent. Also, Letty saw the picture of Adam with the snake for a penis, so I think that kind of led into like how that went. I honestly thought that they were seeing the people that they were currently in love with, and maybe I'm wrong because then I don't know, but that's actually how I interpreted it. Was that was his love from? And
then the spell turned it into torture, right?
Right.
You take what someone loves the most, and then you turn it against them. Yeah.
You know what strikes me, Scott, picking up on what you said about Atticus being always woke and always being able to see, I actually felt like what's also interesting about that is that, and it wasn't until you said what you said that crystallized it for me, is that's actually his character flaw. That's his weakness, right? I mean, so what I'm seeing is Letitia and I'm seeing George, and I'm saying, on one hand, their minds are more pliable. They're able to be to be fogged up and to be forced to forget things. But what's happening with them is that pliability is also the source of their growth. And that pliability also represents their ability to engage and not just engage, but deploy their imagination, right? And I'm seeing, and that's one of my problems with Atticus, is I'm seeing a character that sees everything but has no imagination, no creative capacity, right? His reactions to things are they're I mean, on one hand they're direct, which I value, but they're direct in response to a situation that just doesn't support that directness, right? He encounters his love, and what does he do? He chokes her out.
Yeah, that scene was really, really long and incredibly violent, and it made me. I was very uneasy after about minute 6. I was just sort of why? I just don't understand that. And there's I don't know.
I think
another thing with Asian women, and when we talk about Asian women, the way Asian women are depicted, when we discuss, the Vietnam War and the Korean War, and I don't know, something just.
I thought they were trying to depict the two of them as being tortured, right? I thought that they were both, Letitia and Atticus were both being tortured.
I thought that too, until he threw her through a table. I mean, it was just. It was a lot. It was maybe a bit too much. There's a little overkill in that scene.
Yeah, it went on.
Show too. I know a lot of action, but it was super boring. You're like, okay, you're fighting. I don't. Can we go back to the snake penis?
I have to admit, I fast forwarded through both when I watched it a second time. There wasn't the dialogue there that I'm looking for. So Leandra.
What's interesting though is that George in his encounter, there was a moment in that encounter where so in Letitia and Atticus's moments, they encounter this person who they want to be with, and then something happens and it just turns ugly, right? There was a moment where it was about to turn ugly, and George actually transformed that moment. Remember when they're dancing and she starts talking all these things like you can be with your children, you can fly with your children, and instead of engaging that's this moment of separation in terms of their conversation with one another, and he's like, no. But it's not a no of I'm pushing you away. It's I'm asserting a boundary between you and me. And that becomes a thing. And I was waiting for that situation to turn. I thought, all right, it's going to turn right now. And he said that, and I'm like, he just deflated everything right there.
Absolutely. Leandra, second question.
So I'm going to do favorite scene. And it was kind of hard to pick because I don't know. There was other than the piece, it was really good. But I am really into music. I love music. I'm re-energizing my life with music right now and getting back to it. So I like when they are tracking down his father and Nina is singing Blackbird. And just the lyrics to that around you're never going to fly away, right? And just setting it up. And so even though it's this beautiful rendition, where this is going. And then as they're crossing the bridge, it switches to Marilyn Manson killing strangers. And the lyric is, killing strangers so I don't kill the one that I love. And it brings in, so here's this, woman of color singing this beautiful song about being trapped and not being able to go somewhere. And then it immediately switches to a white guy being like, I'm going to kill the strangers because I don't want to give up what I have. Yeah. And I just think that whole transition was very beautifully done. And I'm just gullible, but the whole car crashing into the visible thing, I didn't see coming. I thought they were just going to chase it down or something. And so that whole thing was just a beautifully done scene with the music and just the way it played out.
It's fantastic. Anybody want to comment on Leandra's favorite scene? I thought the music was just like we said earlier about Gil Scott-Heron. It's just so apropos. It's just on target. It's pointing out the contrast that they want to point out in that moment in the show, and it's fantastic music. I'm going to go ahead and do my favorite line. And it may be odd that you think I'm picking this line, but it is the first time Atticus meets Braithwaite. and he just had his liver removed. And then he's looking at a painting on the wall of the Garden of Eden. And he says this: "At the dawn of time, just for a moment, everything was where and as it should be. From God to man to woman down to the lowliest wriggling creature, it was nirvana." And then the daughter says, "Then that stupid, meddling, troublemaking bitch Eve brought entropy and death. What was an elegant hierarchy became a mess of tribes and nations." And the reason I love the fact that the writers put that line in there, because it goes back to the thing I talked about last time about the cognitive mechanisms you have to create for yourself when you're a torturer, right? The cognitive you have to believe in some kind of divine, unless you're just an utter sociopath, and they exist. But, this divine thing that gives you the right to wreak so much trauma on other people's lives. And then the idea of an order that exists all on its own, and there's no entropy in it, is such an old way of thinking that I was glad they put that in there, because more and more we're starting to understand that there is no order without disorder, right? That order and disorder are actually not, they're part of the same thing. And the idea that you can create what I'll call a clean realm, a pure realm. Just when you listen to people talk that are like that, it's usually this quest for purity that underlies the rhetoric that they're using, the rhetoric they think with. And it was stunning I couldn't tell what the daughter was doing with that bit about Eve. Was she being complicit? Was she making fun of her dad because he had made her recite this so many times? I couldn't figure out what her bit was. But the idea that you can have a reality without entropy is an old one. And I thought it was appropriate to explain something about what you have to think like and believe in order to be that type of person.
It is interesting that you picked that quote, because as soon as you started reading it, I was like, "Ooh, this sounds like Master Racy."
Exactly what it is.
Like,
yeah.
And because like in that scene, like I was still trying to, like take in that this was President Fitzgerald Grant, and I was like, why is he doing this? Like, because I have to let him go of Scandal, but I wasn't ready. I was like, oh,
yes.
I knew he was playing that guy, but whatever. But I think that totally was like, but now that you put it into that sort of context, it makes sense. And I think it is very beautifully done for that character, because just even you were reciting that, I'm like, ooh, that makes me feel uncomfortable.
Exactly. And the guy loved the words, right? And then Atticus comes back and says, "So you're God in this?" He says, "No, I'm Adam." And he says it with pure conviction. Mm-hmm. There's not a trace of doubt. It's not an act. This is who he is. And that's not unlike the ethos of a slave owner in the 1800s. Just this Southern gentleman rhetoric of sort of a divine God's plan that I'm just expressing. I talked last week about how that idea played out during the Revolutionary War, and then deism and the notion of God's natural order. And it's all I'm going to say is when you hear someone start preaching about those kind of things, you know where it's gone. And it's kind of sad and gross and scary. So I'm glad they put that in. What's that?
Full arrogance of it, and just like underneath that, such a weak ego. Like he comes in there and he's like, "I will give you of myself," and like put the silver on a plate. And I love that moment too, where Atticus is like, "Don't do that. This is a crazy white person thing. Like, please don't." Like, and it was just so like,
no.
I don't know. I definitely like the whole area and look that they've got, the Master Race speech, like. And she's being bitter. I mean, I know I've said this before, but she's all being bitter and making fun of it. But like, you want to be Adam. You want to be on top. Like, you're just mad because it's not you.
Yes. No, that's true. And what I look for more and more in my work is how we do this with science. I mean, the Nazis used the notion of scientific truth to justify a lot of their torture. And hiding behind the notions of objectivity allows people to believe they're going towards this quest for your pure objective space.
And psychologists do it too. We've got our own bag, ways that we use psychological mechanisms to justify the racism that we engage in. And anyway,
no, you're absolutely right. So it's not just the crazy guy spouting about being the son of Adam, right? It's people on a mission for absolutes. And
PA director supporting torture, like, you know, like it's just,
yeah, exactly. So go ahead.
It's Tucker Carlson asking, are we surprised that 17-year-olds with rifles are going out and protecting and protecting law and order where no one else would?
I mean, even that idea of law and order is an idea of creating a pure safe space, right? And of course, it's a pure safe space for white people, but it's the idea that somehow there's that space and we can wreak whatever violence we want in the name of creating it.
It's a justification for murder.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that line metaphorically leads to all that, but I love the fact they put it in there. I love he had that conversation with Atticus, and Atticus called him out, thinking the guy might go, "No, I'm not really God." He goes, "No, but I am."
what arrogant.
Damn, man.
There's a quote from Tucker Carlson's this evening in reference to the violence in Kenosha. He says, "How shocked are we that 17-year-olds with rifles decided they had to maintain order when no one else would?"
And there's no irony in that statement at all. That's exactly how Tucker feels. See, I don't watch Tucker, but he was on a different channel years ago.
Yeah.
And this is not how we talked then. And he has completely, I don't want to call compromise, because maybe this is who he is, but he's reorganized his rhetoric around where he's working.
Actually, Blue Dobbs.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah.
Greta Van Susteren.
Yes.
Miles O'Brien. Who else jumped ship for Fox News? There are a few journalists.
Yeah. So you don't know if they jumped ship because that's how they felt, and they felt that Fox was giving them the voice to say what they wanted to say, which is like terribly scary, or they just organized their rhetoric around the money.
Yeah.
But that's just all. Ugh. So Byron, how about your second question?
Well, I'll go with a quote, and it's just a really short one, but I think it was really meaningful for me, because I think for me this episode, and I've watched this episode probably about 4 times now, just because I'm so in love with the way it's dealing with creating a new kind of track on history, right? And the way it's like dealing with this notion of history, but also about, for me, where we are now. And so this line was just a real simple one. It's when Letitia said, when she whispered to Atticus, that's code for slave ship, right? But like shipping. And to me, I was just like, wow, that's just this like really hitting on what I think for me, what the episode was doing was just giving us an opportunity to think about, these notions of history. And I think for me, I'm just connecting it to Watchmen and this kind of putting this history out here that people might not, well, a lot of people don't know about it because they don't care to know about it. They don't want to know about it, right? Because for them, it's just, that was the past, right? Let's leave this alone. And so for her to say that, I think in this episode was really meaningful. But then I also tied it into where we are presently, right? So, I have been torturing myself in watching the Republican National Convention. I'm watching it because I have to. For me, I'm writing a piece on the trauma presidency, and so I want to hear all these things, right? So I had to hear what the McCloskey said, right? All that creates this trauma. But for me, this show, I think by making us really think about and hearing these little lines like that about the really ugly history of America, and you all were talking earlier about, the kind of psychology and stuff. And, it was helpful because all that worries me, because I keep thinking, well, yeah, you can maybe make people confront their microaggressions and these things they say, but I always wonder, does it change, the fact that people are going to be racist and ugly and hate, right? And maybe it's because, I'm something years old where I've seen this and lived through this, and I see people and we go through these different things. And, I'm reading a book now called Bias, and no one get mad at me if you know the author of that book, but to me, it just reads like this self-help book to me. But I'm trying to now think of these things as strategies. And so what I see this doing is, you know, with this kind of putting this history out there and creating this this record of history, that maybe it's this strategy towards helping us understand, you know, this ugliness of the United States, right? And we all know the ugliness of it, but, you know, I have asked my students who can to watch this show, because I think every week is going to give us a little something, right? So we had the, you know, the sundown cities, I'm saying it wrong. And this week with her whispering that, just that little statement about, you know, these slave ships, I know, I think it has this potential of being really productive in creating this new kind of conversation around, let's start by looking at this history. I think if young white kids like that boy who took the rifle to Kenosha probably has no awareness of this history, right? He just knows about this hate and that you should hate Black folk, right? With no connection to the other part of it. And that's not an excuse for him by any means, right? But, you know, for me, I think putting these little statements about history in there, to me, is just kind of important. I think it's a kernel to really, you know, fleshing out this notion of how do we get to where we are now in this country, right? Where, you know, the McCloskeys can aim a gun at, you know, protesters, peaceful protesters, or this boy can go and, you know, shoot 2 people in the head and injure another one, right? Or, you know, where we can have the police. And remember, you know, we had the same thing in Louisiana, what was it, 2 weeks ago, where the police shot this brother 11 times, right? Someone we're not talking about. So, you know, for me, I love that it's doing that, and it's giving these characters these lines to feed to the larger public culture, right? And maybe with those lines going out there, we begin to get an understanding of, you know, the hatred that's been done to Black bodies, while Black bodies continue to try to love this country, right? We want to say, you know, I'm at the point where I don't know if I'm going to say that I'm going to say I love being an American anymore, but, you know, there are people who still say I love America. And I think this is what James Baldwin was actually getting at also, right? He kind of loved America, but he also chastised America. But I think he chastised America by saying, here's this messed up history of America, right? And this is how it's brought us to where we are now. And I think that's something that's really productive about the show.
So that about wraps it up for us. Brothers and sisters of the Seers of Ardham, please tell the audience where they can find you on social media. Stanford.
I'm Stanford Carpenter. You can find me on Facebook and Twitter as Stanford Carpenter. There are a whole bunch of Stanfords out there and a whole bunch of Carpenters out there, but there's just one Stanford Carpenter combined.
Fantastic. Vanessa.
You can find me on Instagram and Twitter at Dr. Vanessa Hintz. Also on Facebook at Dr. Vanessa Hintz. Shout out to the Milwaukee Bucks for boycotting their game today. Way to walk the talk. Shout out to the Bucks.
Fantastic. Cianna.
My name is Cianna Greaves. You can find me on Twitter at CC Greaves. That's at CICIGREA, V as in Victor, E as in Sam.
Fantastic. Leandra?
You can find me on Twitter at Parris Leandra, at Parris Leandra. Parris with 2 R's, not one like France. And shout out to the MLB. I knew I was a baseball fan for a reason.
Fantastic. Byron.
Dr. Byron B. Craig, and you can find me at Byron B. Craig on Twitter. And I'll give a shout out to all the Black moms who are still leading, and the Black women who are still leading the way in this moment of unrest.
I'm Scott Jordan. You can reach me on Twitter at dark_loops. And you can find all episodes of Dark Loops, the Seers of Ardham on YouTube at the Dark Loops Productions channel. If you'd like to leave feedback about this podcast, please leave it below on this YouTube channel or send a message to darkloopsproductions@gmail.com. We'll be sure to read it at the end of our next podcast. So there it is. From all of us to all of you, big hugs, and remember, Black Lives Matter.
You don't need no reason to travel. Unknown horrors living in plain sight. Oh, God, stealing blame drives the world insane. Turn that evil darkness to healing.